Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The morning my parents told me to leave, it was raining, not the dramatic, cinematic kind of rain that feels like the universe is weeping alongside you. It was a gray, indifferent drizzle, the kind that soaks through your jacket slowly so you don't notice how wet you've become until it's already too late. I've thought about that detail a lot over the years. How fitting it was, how the sky didn't even care enough to put on a show. I was 22 years old, 3 months out of college, working a junior position at a marketing firm that paid just enough to keep me buying groceries but not quite enough for first and last month's rent anywhere decent. I was living at home, the plan being that I'd save for 6 months, get on my feet, and move into my own place by spring. It was a reasonable plan. My parents had agreed to it, or so I thought. My sister Natalie was 25. 3 years older than me, and in our household, those 3 years might as well have been 3 decades. Natalie was the sun around which our family orbited. She was beautiful in the effortless way that made strangers stop mid-sentence. She laughed loudly at her own jokes, and somehow that was charming rather than annoying. She had dropped out of college at 19 to find herself, had spent 2 years cycling through boyfriends and half-formed business ideas, and our parents had funded every single chapter of it without a word of complaint. I, on the other hand, had graduated on time with honors with zero financial assistance because my parents had always said their money was tied up. I'd taken out loans. I'd worked part-time through all 4 years. I hadn't complained because complaining wasn't something I did. I put my head down, did the work, and trusted that one day the quiet, steady effort would speak for itself. I was wrong about that too. The conversation happened on a Sunday evening. I remember because I had spent the afternoon preparing a presentation for work, something I was genuinely proud of. I came downstairs to make dinner and found my parents sitting at the kitchen table with the particular stillness that signals a pre-planned conversation. My mother was clasping her hands the way she did in church. My father was looking at the table. Natalie was not in the room, but her presence was everywhere in the brochures spread across the table, glossy and colorful, advertising a culinary arts program in Italy. A full year. Florence. The tuition alone was $40,000, not including housing, flights, or the generous living allowance Natalie had apparently already begun negotiating. "We want to support Natalie's dream," my mother said. I waited for the second part of the sentence, the part that connected this information to me sitting at the table. "We've been looking at the finances," my father added, still studying the wood grain. "And with everything we want to do for Nat, we're going to need the space. Your room specifically, we're going to convert it into a rental for some extra income." I stared at them. "We think it's a good time for you to find your own place," my mother said with the gentle tone of someone suggesting a new haircut. "You have a job, you're young, it'll be good for you." "You want me to move out," I said, "so you can rent my room to pay for Natalie's trip to Italy?" Neither of them said yes, neither of them said no. My father finally looked up, and in his eyes I found something that broke something in me, not cruelty, but a kind of blank practicality, as if the math had simply been done and I was on the wrong side of the equation. "We'll give you 2 weeks," my mother said. I moved into a studio apartment that smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking. I put my clothes in a second-hand dresser, my books in milk crates, and I sat on the edge of a mattress I'd bought off a Facebook listing, and I made a decision. Not a decision born from rage. Rage burns too hot and too fast to be useful. This was something cooler and more patient. A resolution. I was going to build something. And one day when the time was right, I was going to make sure my parents understood exactly what they had thrown away. I didn't have a specific plan yet. Life doesn't work in specific plans, but I had direction, and direction is what matters in the beginning. I threw myself into work with a focus that surprised even me. When you have nothing comfortable to return to, the office stops being a place you endure and becomes a place you conquer. I was the first in and the last out. I took on projects no one else wanted. I asked for feedback constantly and implemented every piece of it. Within 8 months, I was promoted. Within 18, I was promoted again. I stopped spending money on things that didn't matter. I cooked every meal at home. I canceled subscriptions. I wore the same 10 outfits on rotation. I saved with a discipline that bordered on obsessive, and I channeled the loneliness of my little apartment into studying real estate licensing courses at night, financial literacy books on weekends, investment forums I haunted until the language of money started to feel like a second language I was slowly becoming fluent in. I got my real estate license at 24, not because I wanted to change careers, but because I wanted to understand the world I was trying to enter. Knowledge is leverage, and I had learned permanently and painfully what it meant to be without leverage in my own family. I called home occasionally. Natalie was in Florence, sending back photos of herself at outdoor markets and vineyard dinners. My parents spoke about her the way people speak about a beloved series they're watching, with ongoing investment and delight. They asked about me with a different tone, polite, slightly guilty, the tone of people who know they've done something they can't quite defend. I kept the calls short. I kept my voice warm. I was playing a long game. 3 years after they asked me to leave, I bought my first property. A small duplex in a neighborhood that was just beginning the early hum of gentrification, the kind you could feel before you could see it, in the coffee shops appearing between laundromats and the murals going up on previously blank walls. I lived in one unit and rented the other. The rental income covered most of my mortgage. I was 25 years old and I owned property. I called my parents to share the news. "That's nice, honey," my mother said. In the background, I could hear Natalie laughing at something. The years that followed were not glamorous. They were methodical. I made careful decisions, saved aggressively, and reinvested consistently. I bought a second property at 27, a third at 29. I had long since been promoted into a senior position at the firm, then recruited away by a competitor for a role with a salary that would have seemed fictional to the 22-year-old sleeping on a second-hand mattress. I did not flaunt any of this. I drove a modest car. I dressed simply. I returned my parents' calls and I sat through holiday dinners where Natalie's ongoing adventures. The culinary program had pivoted into a wellness coaching certification, which had pivoted into a creative consulting business that my parents continued to financially support, were the primary subject of conversation. I smiled. I ate my food. I waited. The call came on a Tuesday. My father's voice was different, older, and threaded through with something fragile. The culinary school in Italy had been funded partly through a second mortgage on the house. The creative consulting business had required a small investment that had turned into a larger one. There had been other expenses, other needs, other moments where Natalie had asked and they had found ways to say yes. The second mortgage had ballooned. The property taxes had gone unpaid for 2 years. They were significantly behind on payments. The bank was beginning foreclosure proceedings and they were going to lose the house. "We were wondering," my father said, "if maybe you could help." I was quiet for a long moment. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb that had appreciated steadily for 15 years. I knew this because I had watched it quietly, the way you watch something you have unfinished business with. I knew its current estimated value, its tax history, the amount still owed on the original mortgage plus the second. I had run the numbers in my head more times than I would ever admit. "Look into it," I said. I hired a real estate attorney before I made a single call home. I wanted to understand every option available, not because I planned to be cruel, but because I had learned at 22 years old in the rain, carrying a bag of my belongings to a car, that entering a negotiation without full information is how you end up on the wrong side of someone else's math. The numbers were workable. Difficult, but workable. I could purchase the property outright, settle the liens, and resolve the foreclosure. The house would be mine. Legally, completely, irrevocably mine. I sat with that for several days. I thought about who I had been the morning I left, how I had driven away without fully understanding what was happening to me, without words for the quiet devastation of being chosen against. I thought about all the years of second-hand furniture and meal-prepped lunches and nights studying when I would rather have been sleeping. I thought about every phone call where Natalie's life had filled the room and mine had been a footnote, and then I thought about something else. I thought about how I did not want to become someone who let the worst moment of their life define every moment after it. I thought about how the version of myself I was most proud of, the one who had built something from nothing, who had turned exile into education, was not a person who triumphed by tearing others down. She was a person who had simply stubbornly refused to be diminished. There was a difference between justice and revenge, I had come to understand. Revenge wants the other person to suffer. Justice simply wants the scales to reflect the truth. I called my parents and told them I would buy the house. The closing was on a Thursday morning in April. My parents sat across the table from me in the title company's office, and there was something in the geometry of that arrangement that felt significant, the way life sometimes arranges itself into images that mean something. I had prepared a document, separate from the legal paperwork, that I set in front of them before we signed anything. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't a bill of grievances. It was a simple letter, 2 pages, in which I said plainly what had happened, not with bitterness but with precision. I wrote about being asked to leave so my room could be rented to fund my sister's trip. I wrote about the second-hand mattress and the milk crate bookshelves and the decision I had made in the rain to build something anyway. I wrote about every holiday dinner I had attended where I had smiled and said nothing while my inside life remained invisible to them. I did not ask them to apologize because an apology asked for isn't worth much. I simply wanted them to see in writing what the years had looked like from where I was standing. My mother cried. My father read the letter twice slowly and did not speak for a long time. Then we signed the papers. The terms of the purchase included a lease agreement. My parents could remain in the house, had always been able to remain in the house. This was never in question, at a rent set slightly below market rate, enough to be fair without being punitive. I handled the property taxes. I handled the maintenance. For the first time in their lives, someone else was taking care of the house they lived in, and that someone was the child they had driven away in the rain. I did not rub this in. I never referenced it directly. I came for dinners. I fixed things when they needed fixing. I called on birthdays, but I held the deed. And the deed told the truth about everything. Natalie came home from what had become a semi-permanent residency of self-reinvention about 4 months after the sale closed. She was 31, charming as ever, and arrived with the breezy confidence of someone who had never been asked to reckon with consequences. We had a dinner, the four of us, and she spent most of it telling a story about a cooking retreat in Portugal that she was considering leading. At some point she asked, with genuine and uncomplicated curiosity, how I had ended up buying the house. I looked at her for a moment. At her easy smile, her unstudied beauty, the way she occupied space in a room like she had personally been invited by gravity. I just kept working, I said. She nodded as if this was a complete and satisfying answer, because for her it was. She had never needed to know what it cost. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry. If after everything there is still something hot and unsettled living in my chest when I sit at my parents' dinner table in what is technically now my house. The honest answer is, sometimes. There are moments, usually small and quiet ones, a passing comment, a familiar look, a story about something Natalie is doing that is being funded in ways I am now too aware of, where the old feeling surfaces. The feeling of being the child who did everything right and was still found lacking, but it passes. It always passes, because I know something now that I didn't know at 22, wet and stunned, and driving away from a house I thought was home. I know that being chosen against by the people who were supposed to choose you is not a verdict on your worth. It is a verdict on their vision, on what they were able to see and what they couldn't. They couldn't see me, that was their loss. And I had spent 10 years making sure it was only theirs. The deed to my childhood home sits in a file folder in my home office. I don't look at it often. I don't need to. It is enough to know it exists, that the house where I learned I was expendable now belongs to the child they had tried to make expendable. There is no speech that could have said what that document says. Some truths are better written in property records than in words. The rain, at least, eventually stops. Tilde end.